Okay, I think I am live. Let me just make sure. Okay. Alright, I'll get started in just a minute here. Okay, thanks to you who are watching right now. So today we're talking about Smith's discussion of whether or not there's a prima facie obligation to obey the law. So I'm going to start by just going through Smith's definition of this a little bit, just to be clear about what we're talking about. So to give an example of how a prima facie obligation works, we'll use the following. You have a prima facie obligation to refrain from killing your neighbor. Right? You have a moral reason to refrain from killing your neighbor. You know, pretty strong. You shouldn't go around killing your neighbors. And unless you have a moral reason that's at least as strong to kill your neighbor in favor of killing your neighbor, to kill him would be wrong. So, you know, if your neighbor is coming at you with an axe, maybe it's permissible to kill him under those circumstances. You have a pretty strong moral reason to defend yourself, even more so if he's going after lots of other people at the same time. But in the absence of a reason like that, because you have this prima facie obligation to not kill your neighbor, unless you have a reason that is as strong as your reason to not kill your neighbor in the first place, to kill him would be wrong, right? So a prima facie obligation sort of puts the burden of proof on you to say, you've got to have a reason that is at least as good as the reason that the prima facie obligation gives if you're going to violate it, right? So that's how prima facie obligations work. It is a weak form of obligation. It's not like an absolute obligation. An absolute obligation would be you have to do this no matter what. If you fail to do it, you're doing something wrong. Prima facie obligations are a lot weaker because they just ask you for a strong reason to do it, right? And so what Smith wants to talk about then is the question of whether we have a prima facie obligation to obey the law just because it is the law, right? So he doesn't want to consider obligations we might have to not do things that are bad in themselves. So like killing your neighbor, for instance. You already have an obligation to not kill your neighbor. The law coming in doesn't really add much to that, right? So we're asking, in cases where the only thing that we're considering is what the law says, do you have a prima facie obligation to obey the law just because it is a law, just because the state has said you're required or prohibited from doing this, right? So Smith goes on in his paper to tackle three popular forms of argument that we have a prima facie obligation to obey the law. And he starts with the argument from gratitude, or the gratitude argument. And the gratitude argument generally goes something like this. When someone provides you with benefits, you have a debt of gratitude towards your benefactor. So, for example, if someone were to pull you out of a pool while you were drowning and save your life, we would usually think that you owe them some sort of debt of gratitude. It's not always exactly clear the best way that you would fulfill that obligation that you have to have gratitude towards that person. Sometimes, depending on how significant the favor they did for you, sometimes it would just be a thank you would be sufficient to complete your debt of gratitude. Other times you have to be willing to do something for them. There are lots of possible ways to fulfill your debt of gratitude, but in any case, the idea with the obligation to obey the law is that the state, as Socrates pointed out in Crito, provides a great number of benefits to us, right? Socrates points out that it helped us be born in the first place, it provided us with an education, it provides us with lots of goods of society, organized structures of mutual cooperation. And so this argument goes, we owe the state a great debt of gratitude. And the way that we show our gratitude would be to obey its laws. Right? And so government is supposed to get us to this obligation to obey the state's laws. So Smith replies to this in a few ways. The first is that it's not clear that we have a debt of gratitude to someone when they benefit us without any consideration of what we want, for one. So we might not want the benefits that the state gives to us. If someone just comes along and gives you, say, a coupon for something that you don't really buy very much, in some sense they benefited you, but they didn't really consider what you wanted. Like, they were just giving you the coupon without knowing anything about you. Or it's not clear that we have a debt of gratitude when someone benefits us not for our sake, but rather they're pursuing some other end that they have in mind, and it just incidentally benefits us. So, for instance, it's not clear, to go back to a case like the coupon case, if a grocery store has a day where bread is 10% off, and we were planning to go buy bread that day anyway, they've benefited us, but it's not clear that we owe gratitude to the grocery store because of this 10% off sale. They're doing it to drive sales. They're not doing it to benefit us exactly. They're not looking at you and saying, wow, that person is going to want to buy bread today, we should make it a little cheaper for them. That's not what they're saying. They're thinking, we want to drive sales, we want to increase our profits. A 10% sale will get more people in the store, and so on. So the state's benefits to us generally fall under one of those two classes. Either it's something that they're not really considering our interests, they're not thinking about what we want as individuals. They might be thinking about the general welfare, they may be thinking this sort of policy will benefit society, but they're not directing it at us personally. And also, it's often to advance their own ends, whatever they are. So to preserve the power of the state, or to achieve some social goal that they have, right? It's not to benefit us that they give us these benefits, right? And so it's not clear, Smith says, that we really do owe them a debt of gratitude for a large range of the things that they do. The second point is, even if we do have a debt of gratitude towards the state, that doesn't necessarily entail that you need to settle that debt by following the state's commands. There may be other ways for you to show gratitude appropriately. Right, as we talked about before, it's often difficult to know exactly what the right way to show gratitude is for any particular benefit given to you. And it's not always the case that we should do it, as Smith says, in the way which most clearly shows our gratitude or most convincingly shows it, which may be following the laws. But there may be other considerations at play. So likewise, your parents do many great benefits for you, but it's not clear that that means that you have to obey them in everything they tell you. Right? Once you're an adult, in some sense, like, you get to make your own decisions, and even though your parents had benefited you greatly as a child, what they tell you to do now isn't necessarily something you have an obligation to do. Right? You might want to do it, they might be giving good advice, but it's unlikely that you have an obligation just because they benefited you as a child. Now there's another version of the gratitude argument that Smith discusses, and this is called the fair play argument. And this is a little bit more complicated than the previous argument, so I'm going to go through this separately. It says, well, there are two different versions. He talks about Hart and Rawls. But sort of basically it says that if you're involved in, if there's a cooperative enterprise, like if there is some sort of project or way of living that lots of people are engaging in, which creates benefits for many people, those who benefit from others participating in and submitting to the enterprise have a duty to obey the rules and similarly submit themselves to that enterprise. And this duty is one of fairness to the other people who sacrificed in order to create these benefits for you. So the idea is you took these benefits and they only exist as a result of sacrifice on the part of others. So it's your responsibility then to do your part to also sacrifice for the benefit of those who sacrificed for you. All right, that's the sort of general idea. And Smith responds in this way. This makes sense, but there are lots of cases where it's not clear that this is really going to give you an obligation to obey all of the rules. Right, so he says, sorry, just a second. He says that it makes sense for the for you to submit yourself to the rules when doing so will benefit those other members who had sacrificed themselves for you, or if by not submitting you would harm them, right? But it's not clear that you have a duty to submit when it would neither benefit them for you to submit, nor would it do them any harm for you not to submit, right? In those sort of cases, it's not really clear that fair play gives any reason to obey the rules that were set out. And so he says in small voluntary communities, the rules are often going to be very simple and all directed towards issues where it would be the case that other people would benefit from you following the rules and other people would be harmed from you not following the rules. But in large, complex enterprises like the United States or any large nation state, it's a lot less clear that any individual failing to follow through on a great number, that there'll be a great number of rules that if an individual doesn't follow through on them, they won't harm anyone else by not following through, and no one would have been benefited if they did follow through. So Smith gives the example of laws prohibiting homosexual activity as one case. It's not clear that anyone is benefited by someone obeying this prohibition, nor that anyone would be harmed by breaking such a law. You can think of lots of other cases too. Traffic rules. If you're on an empty street, is it clear that anyone would be benefited from you coming to a full stop at a stop sign? or that anyone would be harmed by you not coming to a full stop at a stop sign, it's not really, it doesn't seem obvious that that's the case. And yet, if we had a general prima facie obligation to obey the law, then you would be obligated to make the full stop, even when it's a completely empty street, there's no one around for miles, and so on. But fair play doesn't really seem to justify that sort of obligation. And that's Smith's point. A point that Smith doesn't make here is that it's also unclear that the duty of fair play can respond to his previous worries. So if the benefits that you get from this cooperative enterprise are not ones that you requested or even would request, or if they're given not with an eye to your interest but to the benefactor's unrelated ends, it's not clear that the fair play considerations work in those cases. For example, we might say that the Arizona Cardinals are a cooperative enterprise that provide benefits to many of their fans. However, it's hardly clear that the fans have any duty from fair play to obey whatever rules the Cardinals might come up with, even if some of those rules might benefit the members of the Arizona Cardinals who have sacrificed, right? So that's just like an example case where it doesn't seem like fair play is going to get us the kind of answer that makes sense in this sort of case, for exactly the same reason that the earlier gratitude arguments didn't. So, in the next part of his paper, Smith goes on to discuss a second sort of argument. And I should say, for those who are watching, you can feel free to jump in with questions at any time. I'll be happy to discuss them. I'm just going through this until someone stops me with a question. So, in the second part, he talks about a second kind of argument, and those are the arguments that are based on implicit consent or giving a promise, right? So you can recall that Socrates made this sort of argument in Crito. Just by living within the borders of a state, according to Socrates, means that you're giving your tacit consent to obey the state's rules, according to Socrates. And Smith argues, in response to this sort of claim, Locke makes this sort of claim too, that living within the borders is an implicit way of consenting to it. Smith argues that it's difficult to show how living in a place could count as consent in the necessary sense. So he talks a little bit about the theory of speech acts, where you take an action like consenting just by saying something like, I consent to X, right? And intending that other people understand you to be taking that action. And he points out that this sort of analysis, it seems very difficult to see how living in a place could make it the case that you're trying to make others understand that you consent to all of the rules of that place, right? I've never thought to myself, yes, by living in Arizona, I'm wanting to communicate to everyone else that I accept and consent to all of the rules that Arizona might come up with for its residents. That's not something that I ever intended to do by way of living in Arizona. And as Smith points out, really that probably doesn't apply to anyone except those who are particularly enamored with social contract theory. So he goes on then to discuss two other defenses of the implied consent view, both of which rest on the existence of a democratic form of government, some sort of government where you can have some sort of say, that you can vote, that you can express your opinion on what should be done. The first says that participation in the voting process itself, either by voting or abstaining, counts as consent. Smith rightly points out that this sort of claim seems underdeveloped, that it seems to be resting on a premise that is either going to beg the question, which is to say that it assumes its conclusion in the process of trying to prove it, or is just insufficient to get the conclusion that he's going for. You can go into Smith to look at this argument in more detail, but that's sort of the outline of his response. The second argument has a similar problem, as Smith points out. The second argument shows the superiority of a form of government that is broadly democratic. And Smith points out that without further argument, this doesn't really get you where you need to go. The argument misses the essential premise that we ought to obey any government at all. And ultimately, Smith says we find that this sort of premise is going to be founded on utilitarian considerations, which is what he'll discuss next. So getting into that, the third kind of argument that he discusses is this utilitarian sort of argument. Now, for those of you who haven't taken a course that has discussed utilitarianism before, I'll give a very brief overview, but I'm not going to go too much into it because it is a sort of complex topic. Utilitarianism is a moral theory. That is, it's a theory about what the moral truths are, what you ought to do, what you ought not to do. And it says that we're morally required to do what creates the greatest amount of good for everyone. That is, if we were to take the amount of good that everyone experiences and add it all up, that would be our measure of how good our action was. Right? I'm not going to go into great detail, like I said, about exactly how utilitarianism works or its variations, except as necessary. Just as a starting point, there are two sorts of utilitarianism that Smith talks about. One is called act utilitarianism, and the other is called rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism says that the previous rule, that we're morally required to do whatever creates the greatest amount of good for everyone, is a rule that you should think about when you're for each of your actions. They're justified on the basis of the extent to which they satisfy that rule. Whereas act utilitarianism, on the other hand, that was act utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, says that we should create a set of rules for each of us to live by, and when we're thinking about what to do, we just reference those rules. We don't think about the question of what's going to create the greatest amount of good for everyone. Rather, we just say, are we following these rules that we've set up? But we set up the rules in a way which, if people followed them, then they would create the greatest amount of good for everyone, right? So the rules are designed in accordance with that earlier utilitarian principle, but each person's actions are just supposed to follow the rules because they're already set up to push them in the right direction, right? Again, it's not critical that you understand the distinction between these two to understand Smith. You can sort of just look at the arguments on their own and see his point. But anyway, the general way that these arguments go, and I can speak about both the act and rule versions, is to say that if people fail to obey the law, then the law is going to cease to exist, right? You're going to undermine the state and its laws by failing to obey them. And this is a point that Socrates made in the Credo as well. You'll remember early on that's one of the points that the laws were making to him, speaking through his voice. Although I don't think Socrates was making this point for utilitarian reasons. He wasn't saying it would be a disaster for everyone if the laws collapsed. Rather, he was just making the point about the relationship between our obeying the laws and the law's existence. But in any case, the utilitarian point here is that, look, the laws, having all these laws, having a state, provides great benefits to everyone, and doing things which would tend to undermine or tend to destroy these laws are therefore going to do great harm to everyone. Right? Smith replies to each of these sorts of arguments in basically the same way, which is to say that, of course, if the destruction of the entire system was at stake, then you would have a prima facie obligation to obey the law. But in many cases, almost nothing is at stake, and in fact, more good can be done by breaking the law than by following it. So these sort of utilitarian arguments are too simple and don't consider the sort of cases where you could not obey the law in a particular case and it will turn out much better doing that than if you had obeyed the law. You can probably think of lots of cases of this on your own as examples. In the fourth section, Smith considers how weighty, and so these earlier three sections were all Smith discussing various arguments for the existence of a prima facie obligation to obey the law, for an obligation to obey the law just because it is the law, right? So he thinks that he's sort of dispensed with pretty much all of those arguments. Not to say that he's definitively proved that there is no prima facie obligation to obey the law, but at the very least he's shown that the major arguments for it all have some sort of defect, or rely on controversial ethical theories. In the fourth section, Smith says, let's just assume that there is a prima facie obligation to obey the law. How weighty is that obligation? And he has two different tests for judging the weightiness of an obligation. What you need to know ultimately is that he argues that it's not going to be particularly weighty at all, because it just doesn't add very much to most obligations that you would have to say, also this would be a way of breaking the law. So he gives this example. Suppose that I told you a man, Jones, had broken the law. I'm not going to tell you if it was something that was bad in itself, apart from the law that he did. I'm not going to tell you if he had any good reasons for it. I'm just going to tell you that he broke the law. How confident are you that he did something wrong, that he did something immoral? Right? And Smith says, you're not going to be very confident at all. You're going to want to hear a lot more about what Jones did before you decide whether he did something immoral. So this suggests to Smith that it's probably not a very weighty obligation to obey the law just because it is the law, even if there is such an obligation. And he says that this obligation is probably so lacking in weight that it's not really worth considering at all. It's just something we should ignore. Because in doing our analysis, it's just going to distract us, right? It's not going to do us any good. He also goes into a bit of a discussion in this section about how this could play into an analysis of civil disobedience. We're going to talk more about civil disobedience when we come to King tomorrow, so I'm going to leave that aside for now. In his final section, Smith considers his earlier lawyer's question. I'm not going to talk about that. It's not really very relevant. And he also just gives a general conclusion. So that's all for Smith. If you who are watching have any questions, I'd be happy to discuss them. Anything about Smith, or even anything previously, or anything about the class, I'm happy to talk about anything you want. Is there a difference to obeying the law if your right was natural or civil. Could you say a little bit more about what you mean when you're distinguishing your rights from natural or civil? Do you mean like if your rights ultimately come from the state versus coming from nature? Is that the sort of thing you're getting at? Right. So your right to do what, I guess, is what I'm wondering then. Do you mean all of your rights in general, or do you just mean your right in some particular case? Ah, okay. Does everyone have the same obligation to follow the laws? I would think. I would think that both Smith and Socrates would agree that everyone has the same obligation to follow the laws. It's just whether the obligation applies to you or not might differ. So, for instance, for Socrates, he might say that a citizen's obligation to follow the laws is a lot different from just a visitor's obligation to follow the laws. Smith, I think, would say that no one has a prima facie obligation to follow the laws. I think or at least, again, it's so lacking in weight that it's not really relevant. And I don't think that's going to turn on whether your rights are primarily ones given by the state or natural rights. Though it sounds to me like both Socrates and Smith would agree that you have at least some natural rights. Does that answer your question, or? People oppose the state telling them what to do. A lot of people do oppose the state telling them what to do. That's right. But even if you think that it's generally all right for the state to tell you what to do, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have an obligation to obey the laws. So you might think, for instance, that your parents give really good advice, and you think it's great that they tell you what to do all the time. But you still might think, even though they give good advice and I appreciate their advice, I don't have an obligation to follow whatever commands my parents give me. Right? I'm an adult. I can decide for myself. So there's a gap between saying, I think that it's okay and I think that it's useful for the state to tell me what to do, and I have an obligation to do whatever the state tells me to do. Right? If I think the state has made an error in a particular case, I'm willing to break from its commands and do what I think is right. Okay. Are there any other questions that anyone has? Okay, thanks. I will talk to you all again tomorrow then.